So welcome to our final class on democracy and why they fail. I'm happy to field suggestions and comments, but I'm also going to bring up the fifth and final handout, which I'll send around after. My thought was if we discuss Strauss's essay in the first hour or so and then have a break, and I've got a brief articulation of what each of the thinkers we discussed thought about the principle of democracy and why they fail. And that won't take long for me to run through that, and then we can discuss as we go, or have a more full discussion at the end. Yeah, so please break in at any time and ask questions or make comments. So first of all, Strauss. And Strauss, it's not an accident that he's writing. He asked a what is question, like the Socratic question is, what is something? Justice, what is nobility, and so on. And so Strauss is suggesting, by asking what is political philosophy, he's suggesting that it is something that has an essence that's knowable and unchanging. And that's his project as a thinker and writer, was to resurrect the notion that political philosophy is possible, that there are fundamental political questions. There may not be fundamental answers, but the quality of every answer historically given depends upon the quality of your understanding of the question. So first point he makes is that the question of political philosophy is inescapable, because every society has to posit some life as good and has to provide an answer to what a good human being is. Now, obviously it gets complex in modernity, because modern political philosophy, not modern societies as a whole, but modern political philosophy, in at least its dominant strain, posits that there is no good life. There are bad things that we wish to avoid, and something is good because it helps you avoid those bad things. Now, even a society based on those principles still has to posit that there is a good human being, for example, one that obeys the law. And that becomes a tension within modern societies because of this apparent contradiction between the principle of modern political philosophy and what any society must do. And that's one of the reasons why Strauss is saying that classical political philosophy has a legitimacy that requires us to return to it, and has a breadth that is greater than the moderns, that allows us to understand modern society in the light of more genuine principles. Okay, so he begins the essay just with these are his section titles: the problem of political philosophy, and then the classical solution and the modern solution. And the modern solution ends with a dilemma that sends us right back to the beginning of the problem of political philosophy. So just as he is saying that the problems that we face are A, inescapable, and B, not capable of complete solution, that's also just in the way he writes. It's part of the structure of the essay. So he is trying to delineate in this first part, he's trying to delineate political philosophy in opposition for various kinds of activities that are mistaken for political philosophy. And he means by political philosophy, the branch of philosophy that examines political things. And that's not a small thing or an arbitrary thing, it's the human things. So I think I may have mentioned Aristotle in the Ethics discusses his philosophizing about the human things, and he means the ethics and the politics together. So what's the best life and what's the best political regime? Those two go together, and as a whole, that's the human things. And there are lots of things now that we would consider more interesting and specifically human: history of art, history of music, and so on. for Aristotle and for the classics in general, all of those things are subordinate to the political, because how much one studies art or music or literature is determined by the character of the political regime. I think that happens to be true. So, as we can see from the art, literature, and music that is propagated, say, in our society, in 19th century France, in 14th century Belgium, and so on. Those the character of what we now call a culture is derivative fundamentally from the political regime. Okay, so political philosophy is therefore the study of the fundamental political or human questions, and therefore it's a branch of philosophy as a whole, which is the attempt to replace opinions about the whole with knowledge. And he contrasts that with political thought, which is just the exposition of any thesis concerning political things. Political theory, which in the time that he is writing is more or less an abstraction from political thought or from political science. But it's not theory in the classical sense of a viewing of the being or something. But yeah, political theology, which is not based upon unaided human reason. Social philosophy, and now we would say, if you go into a bookstore now, you'll see cultural studies. That's what social philosophy was in the 60s. And that means to replace the whole, that what the classics and Strauss are arguing is the genuine whole within which human beings have a place, which is the political community, and to say that the society that exists within that community, or the culture that, or cultures that exist within that community, that is the genuine whole within which human beings have a part. And so again, he finds that inadequate for that reason. Now, he spends most of his time discussing political science as the contrast with political philosophy, and because political science is the respectable version of political philosophy in our time, and it's respectable because it tries to mimic the natural sciences in its approach to the human things. Now, that has two problems. One, it's impossible, because in principle, the natural sciences can't talk about better or worse, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, political life and political philosophy are devoted to the questions of what is better or worse as a way of life and as a political regime. So political science, as it's currently constituted, is impossible. It can't do what it's setting out to do. And secondly, it's degrading, because if you try to apply a value-free standard to things that inherently have worth or don't have worth, you'll destroy the phenomena in your attempt to understand it. I'll read a passage that comes from his articulation of this problem, which is less rhetorical than mine. I'll just go to his essay. I'm just going to start with a passage where he's discussing what I'm describing as the impossibility of avoiding political philosophy. And this is where it's, and I'll start, from where he says, all political action aims at either preservation or change. When desiring to preserve, we wish to prevent a change to the worse. When desiring to change, we wish to bring about something better. All political action is then guided by some thought of better and worse. But thought of better or worse implies thought of the good. The standard by which you judge each individual thing to be better or worse implies the existence of that standard. So the awareness of the good which guides all our actions has the character of opinion. It is no longer questioned, but on reflection, it proves to be questionable. The very fact that we can question it directs us towards such a thought of the good as is no longer questionable, towards a thought which is no longer opinion, but knowledge. So all political life and all political communities have within them they have within them a direction that points towards knowledge of political things. So all political communities are constituted by convictions or opinions that point towards knowledge. So all political communities point towards political philosophy and the necessity of political philosophy, because all political communities are founded upon opinions about the most important object of thought for the community. So that's his articulation of the impossibility of avoiding political philosophy. Let's find the page number. So then we come to political science, which attempts to mimic natural science. And he refers to this as positivism, after Comte's positivism. So I'll start from the beginning of this paragraph. A discussion of the tenets of social science positivism is today indispensable for explaining the meaning of political philosophy. It's today indispensable. Obviously, in another time and place, he'd start from a completely different place. We reconsider especially the practical consequences of this positivism. Positivistic social science is value-free or ethically neutral. It is neutral in the conflict between good and evil, however good and evil may be understood. This means that the ground which is common to all social scientists, the ground on which they carry on their investigations and discussions, can only be reached through a process of emancipation from moral judgments, or of abstracting from moral judgments. Moral obtuseness is the necessary condition for scientific analysis. And that's why what you gradually get over decades of an attempt to understand human phenomena in the light of a value-free methodology is a gradual coarsening of the articulation of the human phenomena. And it feeds into itself. For to the extent to which we are not yet completely insensitive to moral distinctions, we are forced to make value judgments. The habit of looking at social or human phenomena without making value judgments has a corroding influence on any preferences. The more serious we are as social scientists, the more completely we develop within ourselves a state of indifference to any goal, or of aimlessness and drifting, a state which may be called nihilism. Now, that's at stage 7, I'm going to say, and we're at stage 11. And what has happened between stage 7 and stage 11 is as follows. First of all, the denial that there are any rational ends. And that means that people's attachments tend to be eroded and they tend to become nihilistic. Sometimes they'll get piercings and take up a drug habit. Sometimes they'll become, healthcare social scientists and so on, other passionless activities. And then, but finally though, the obverse of the notion that there is no rational significance to any particular activity is the devotion to an irrational attachment. And that's why now we have quite passionate attachments to things like identity, which is not a rational category that you can criticize or distinguish and rank correlative to other identities. It just is. Okay, and it is through its passionate attachment. And ultimately, of course, that means it exists because you believe it exists. And if you can impose your will on others, they have to bow to your belief that it exists. And you have fully conquered nature. So that's the ultimate mimicry of modern natural science. I'll go back to Strauss and his less rhetorical presentation. Okay, so yes, his fundamental point is that social phenomena is thoroughly imbued with things that are better or worse. And to call them value judgments and to say you can't study value judgments means that you're not studying the phenomena. Now, one of his great insights is that positivism, or the attempt to turn social sciences into a natural science, will ultimately lead to historicism. So historicism is the view that almost everyone now holds, that the truth doesn't exist. The truth is relative to your time and place. So you're a German in the 30s or an Italian in the 1480s or whatever it is. Each society has a horizon within which something makes sense and something is true, but the truth is relative to that point of view. And this, he says, is the serious antagonist of political philosophy. It's the serious one because positivism necessarily undermines itself, but it turns itself into historicism. And he doesn't name Heidegger, but I'll read the passage where he mentions what happens to historicism.
Just while you're finding that page, Martin,
Yep.
Even though I agree with what you're saying and what Strauss has said, but it also seems to me that there's some truth in the idea of the relativity of perspectives from age to age. And what I mean by that is it's impossible to not be in a particular location at a particular time. And so when you're at a particular location at a particular time, it does, by the fact of location at a place in time, it means that it will inform what you do and how you do it. So, yeah, I'm just sort of suggesting that it's not entirely false.
The thing is, it has to be entirely false or entirely true. Now, from Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, and Strauss's point of view, he's arguing precisely that every time and place, or every political community, is founded upon opinion. And that opinion, thoroughly informs every activity. I mentioned before, art, literature, everything. Everything that we think of constituting a culture is actually subordinate to the character of the regime. So the convictions of the regime thoroughly and utterly inform everything that everyone thinks and does. But that's different from saying that that's the truth. How we have these little lying locutions that we use, like, oh, that's true for you, which is a way of using the word truth that denies the meaning of the word truth. But it just allows us to get out of that problem that there might be some truth. So historicism is either completely true, in which case there's no ahistorical truth. And the best we can do is something like, Heidegger or Nietzsche, is try to peer behind the historical forms to see what gives rise to the formation process. But there's no form that's atemporal. There's nothing atemporally true that can be grasped.
Martin, when you say the regime determines the culture and the art and the literature and so on, how do you explain what you're doing?
Sedition.
So it hasn't got to you. I mean that's my point. I mean, there will always be independent thinkers and artists and writers and composers and thinkers.
Obviously I'm simplifying to make a suggestion at all.
Yeah.
And part of our tradition includes political philosophy as originally understood by the Greeks. That's one of the things handed down with our tradition until about the late 19th century. It was a very strong part. So, you know, the two books, when you do classics at Oxford, were the Ethics and the Republic. And that stopped only decades ago. So those, you know, works like that used to inform the broader society, and the high status of classics, which used to have a very high status in much of the Western world, especially Germany and England. And that used to inform public debate, public policy, along with other things, Christianity and so on. What I'm suggesting is that the modern principles, we have the modern principles now almost alone, without any other influence. And so that's why things are becoming more bare and stark. That, you know, you don't appeal to any other principle other than the rights. You know, people, for example, during the recent mandates and so forth, have been appealing to human rights, which makes no sense. But there's no other, we don't have any other principle that you can appeal to.
I suppose I understand you to be saying then that the regime can be mixed in varying degrees.
It is always mixed to some, yeah, it's always mixed.
Yeah,
But it's the informing character,
yes,
and
understand.
which possesses that mix. It is becoming more simplified in the modern West, and that's the particular tensions we have derive precisely from the tensions within the modern principles. Having the other ones have dissipated. So up until, say, the 19th century, again, I'm just being simplistic to the point of making a point, but up until the end of the 19th century, you know, if you're in Britain, you have the religious tradition, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the parliamentary tradition, and local traditions, and the classics, all informing how the country understands itself. All of the others have dissipated down to the modern teaching on right. And now it's absolutely no coincidence that the art and literature has flattened at the same time, and that those are parallel phenomena. Because once you just have the modern principles, then your literature will become a record of what happens when you exit the state of nature and enter society, which will be a record of injury or pathos that you suffer by being made to enter a society and having to conform to certain things and so on. And that's what our literature has become now. Yeah. More or less serious versions. But now, what I was going to come to was just the end of this discussion of the problem of political philosophy. So he begins from where we are, which is political philosophy has attempted to turn it into a science, and that has to fail because it's about things that are better or worse, more or less just, and so on. And so therefore, anything that attempts to turn it itself into a value-free science will come to the following point. It will realize that every attempt to be scientific is founded upon a particular intention, a particular value, a particular inclination, cultural principle, or something. And so that means that science is not universal and value-free. It, in fact, is embedded in a particular historical opinion. So science will be overcome by culture, and that's exactly what we have now. That's why mathematics is white supremacy and so on. The sciences, I remember 20 or 30 years ago when my suggestion, which is like a footnote to Strauss's suggestion, is that the sciences are going to go, because once the humanities goes, that's your self-understanding. And that means the sciences will become historicist and relativistic. But the sciences were full of contempt for these moronic humanities. They could go and have their arguments with Derrida. The sciences were fine, but they're not fine, not anymore. So now they're having to change the way they understand science itself as being an historical institution that has committed historical crimes and needs to make up for it in various ways. So that's all happening. This the positivist, the attempt to be positivist, inevitably turns into historical relativism. Now, the problem with historical relativism is that you are now saying that there is no universal principle outside of, by main means of which you could judge your own political community. And this historic, and I'm going to read this final section. It was the contempt.
What page is it, Martin? What page is it there?
27, at the very top. It was the contempt for these permanencies. So the idea that there are permanent questions, even if there aren't permanent solutions, but there are permanent questions and a permanent human nature. That's the older view, and historicism rejects that view for everything being relative to a particular historical epoch. It was the contempt for these permanencies which permitted the most radical historicist, that is Martin Heidegger, in 1933 to submit to, or rather to welcome, as he did with it, he gave a famous speech at the University of Freiburg welcoming in the revolution in 1933, and he was rector for a year and a half, and gave a number of speeches, endorsing the National Socialist Party and so forth, and the referendum for Hitler in 36, and the retaking the Rhineland and so on. So to welcome as a dispensation of fate the verdict of the least wise and least moderate part of his nation, while it was in its least wise and least moderate mood, and at the same time to speak of wisdom and moderation. So I'm going to simplify this, but if the meaning of your life and the meaning of your communal life is not something that is discoverable or judged by reason, because there's no human nature, then it's given to you in a particular historical epoch in a certain way, and you can't judge that. All you can do is authentically appropriate it, authentically live it, or you can inauthentically turn away from it, right? And this statement here about the least wise and least moderate part, in this rectorate speech he gave in 1933, he says towards the end that the youth of the nation have decided the character of the being of the German people, right? So if you have no ahistorical standard, then that which is most authentic and most passionately grasped by a number of people, that becomes the essence of what you are, your identity, as opposed to your principles, right? Okay, so that's that very complicated historicist teaching that Heidegger has in Being in Time and other works led to this political action. Yeah, at the same time, to speak of wisdom and moderation, because he is saying that, because Heidegger is saying that what is wise and moderate is to turn away from the supposed universals that are degrading human beings to the authentic attachment to your historical dispensation. So the biggest event of 1933 would rather seem to have proved, if such proof was necessary, that man cannot abandon the quest of the good society, and that he cannot free himself from the responsibility for answering it by deferring to history or to any other power different from his own reason. So the calamity that followed from the Nazi revolution means that we have to both pose the question and answer it. Even if the question's unanswerable, we still have to come to an answer that's adequate to our time. But that's why this is the first section, is the problem, because we cannot escape the problem of political philosophy. What is just, what is good, and what's a good regime? So then, yeah, any questions on that? I've only read 2 paragraphs from 12 pages or something. So I've zapped through. So if there's any question you have about anything that you saw in it, or about...
So I'm sorry, Martin, I just asked this before. So what you just read, referring to the year 1933, what page is that on?
27.
27, okay. Okay, well, okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so next chapter, the classical solution. So he points out that classical political philosophy arose when traditions were shaken, but there was not yet a tradition of political philosophy. So it's an original founding of a discipline. And therefore, so this is Strauss's point. It looked at things with unequal directness. Now, this actually goes back to Chris's point about historicism, because that makes Strauss, he's not an historicist, but he is saying that certain epochs can see things with greater acuity than other epochs. And that's not historicism, but it can be mistaken for it, or it comes close to it. So and second point, classical political philosophy looked at political life from the inside, and so in his view was free of fanaticism and utopianism. Now, by looking at political life from the inside, he means alongside the politician, the statesman, and the legislator, the political philosopher is trying to arbitrate between various claims about what is justice. So he's looking at the same question as the political actor and as the political thinker, and not looking at it from the outside like a closed system in the manner of a modern scientist or a modern political scientist trying to mimic a natural scientist. Now, he claims that later political thought is derivative from classical political thought because it assumes that there can be knowledge of political things and that the life of the political philosopher is possible and the activity of the political philosopher is necessary. Those are the things that Aristotle tried to justify and Plato tried to justify in their works. But modern political philosophy assumes that and then just looks for the best system. Now, okay, I'll just mention, so he's saying that, yeah, classical political philosophy arose when traditions were shaken. And then he tries to show, well, he suggests that this is actually the condition for the emergence of philosophy and of political philosophy. So, and he discusses Plato's laws here in this context. Plato's laws begins, it's a conversation between two elderly men, a Spartan and a Cretan, who are going to found a city, and another man who's an Athenian stranger. And Strauss, to my knowledge, the only person since Aristotle to identify the Athenian stranger with Socrates, argues as follows. Socrates is going to educate these two legislators into making legislation in the light of political philosophy. And to do that, he has to loosen their attachment to their ancestral beliefs. So he begins by trying to make the distinction that is the distinction necessary for philosophy to emerge, which is that there's a difference between the old and the good, because in every political community, especially, well, every traditional political community identifies the old and the ancestral stories and laws with what is good. For philosophy to emerge, those ancestral things must be held to be merely opinions and not the full truth. And then they can be they can be understood to be partially good and perhaps partially in need of correction. But that means the standard outside the ancestral by which we can correct them. And he makes this point another way by defending the Athenian institution of symposia, which, contrary to contemporary academic experience, are amusing and enlivening drinking parties. And it's quite an odd thing, and I think only Strauss has a very good explanation for this several pages on symposia at the beginning of the laws. It's that by talking about drunkenness, he is indirectly making his interlocutors slightly lightheaded or drunk, open, more open in their thought. And that might sound implausible, but I've had an experience where I was at Boston College, and there were two otherwise quite sober people, one professor and one student, and they started talking about being drunk, and their features changed and the way they acted changed. And I just thought I've just seen an illustration of how people's mood can change by talking about something without actually experiencing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. And just a quick aside. So in the laws there, they're saying the old is identified with the good, but in modern thought, and including modern democratic thought, isn't it the opposite, that the new and the novel is always thought to be better? And indeed, I think that was sort of stated at the beginning of the Republic when they were talking about democratic, the tenor of a democracy with colour and novelty and so on.
Yeah, that's true too. That's true too. But it also, you mean, the Athenian democracy though had these spasms where it returned to the ancestral thing. For example, when there was the desecration of the statues of Hermes at the crossroads, they immediately killed a lot of people for impiety, returning to the ancestral. But that is the mark of, it is one of the possible marks of democracy, but it's definitely the mark of modernity. So and there's a very good statement about this by Descartes in one of his letters, where he says that the point of philosophy is to innovate. And something you hear political figures and business figures, and everyone has the word innovation. And they obviously are using it in a trivial and derivative sense, but the new can only be the good if we have a way of understanding things that will produce better and better productions. Otherwise, the old is the good, because the old provides the principles within which everything new occurs. But modernity rejects that and says, no, we know what the goods are. The human goods, self-preservation, comfortable life, and so on. So what we need is the power to bring about further and further progress in achieving those goods. But that means you're replacing philosophy by a method, and that's what occurred in the early modern period. Now, just for time, okay, so he raises two objections to classical political philosophy. One, it's not democratic, and two, it's rubbish because it's based upon an understanding of nature and the nature of the whole within which human beings live that is scientifically wrong. So, and his responses are as follows. Classical political philosophy was aware of the advantages of democracy, and we saw that in the Republic. In the mythological descent from the probably impossible best regime, it was only in democracy that philosophy appeared or was possible, or appeared to be possible. But their qualification, the classics, was that freedom can't be the end of political life, because human excellence requires education and the formation of character, and that requires leisure. And leisure was not widely available, and so it couldn't be a democratic feature. That's not accidental though. Now, he says ultimately this comes down to a difference regarding the value of technology, and I'll quickly find that passage on page 37, because that is ultimately the difference between the ancients and the moderns. So the difference between the classics and us with regard to democracy consists exclusively in a different estimate of the virtues of technology. But we are not entitled to say that the classical view has been refuted, that is, by our greater technical proficiency. Their implicit prophecy that the emancipation of technology, of the arts, from moral and political control would lead to disaster or to the dehumanization of man has not yet been refuted. I think that that's a powerful comment. So there are only these hints in Plato and Aristotle that the unleashing of technology would lead to the dehumanization of human beings. And there's I think it's chapter 8 of book 2 of the Politics, where Aristotle discusses a couple of very early political thinkers prior to Plato. And those are his 3 main targets in book 2 on the best regime. And there he says that someone who's praising technology, that is, he says you should have awards for people who produce new arts and sciences, new techni. And he says, laws are not like the other arts and sciences like house building and so forth. In those, innovation and improvements is good, but in law, the more frequently you change the law, that is your way of life, the more you will undercut the power of the law. That is the possibility of people living in a coherent way of life itself. And one of the implications is that once you make innovation and technical change will always lead to a change in a way of life. Just look at what computers have done to us. Once you make change the principle and culture and enculturation secondary, you will undercut the very possibility of people having intellectual and ethical excellence in Aristotle's view. And that's why I think Strauss says hasn't been refuted.
Martin, is Strauss using technology in a broader sense, perhaps, than I'm thinking, to embrace the arts as well?
He does mean, well, just the increased power we have over everything, including nature. But he read this essay by Heidegger on technology. And so he does, and he seems to be alluding to it here, that technology is the modern mode. It's one of the things that are definitive of our whole epoch, and it's coming to dominate human existence.
But not just information technology, the mechanization of society.
Yeah, the whole mechanization of society.
Yeah. Well, I guess when he gave the lectures, IT wasn't big at all.
No, but I can give you an example that helped make things slightly clearer for me. If you read the oldest poetry we have, say Hesiod, he talks about certain realities of life, and one of them is you have to have a bull pull your plow so you can farm, so you can eat. Right now, my teacher of Greek and Latin was David Green at Chicago University, and he didn't have to because he was a professor at Chicago University, but he kept a small farm with a bull and a plow, and so that he understood when he read Virgil's Georgics, he understood what the poems were about fully, and it was possible for him to farm in that way in the 50s. It's not possible now. No one could do that now and still sell some product from their farm because they'd be just destroyed by the highly mechanized agriculture going on next door. So, but that means that from 700 BC to 1950, it was possible to understand the horizon within which people lived and some of the same realities now. But because of technology, one aspect of that reality is no longer available to us. And that's just a small fragment. Many aspects of what has been normal human life are now, I don't want to say distorted, but they're no longer visible to us. And that's one of the problems.
I wonder. So I wonder if in the Heidegger and the, I suspect that in the Heidegger and the Strauss view, particularly in the Heidegger view, there would be some appreciation of the massive effects of early technologies, such as the use of a spear and those primitive tools and that kind of thing. And they must have had massive, and the building of the simplest shelters by human beings must have had huge effects on the human spirit. And so I just find it a little difficult to say that the 20th century was sort of, or you're suggesting the mid 20th century was the decisive turning point in this uprising of technology. It's been a pretty gradual thing, I would say, even though, since the Enlightenment in the 18th century, let's say, that wonderful, really quite beautiful appreciation of modern tools in the plates in Diderot's encyclopedia, and really looking with a bright eyes to a rosy future in that publication. But it's all, 200 years later, it all starts looking very dark, obviously, with nuclear war and these weapons of mass destruction and so on.
Well, there were people at the time, like Swift, who could foresee the problems and were critics and wanted to reject the Enlightenment on that basis. I'm not saying they're right, but I'm just saying that the problem was visible from the beginning. But also, I wasn't saying at all that was some kind of turning point. I was just trying to find an example of where things that are visible become invisible. And that was just a very small example. If anything, the tipping point is over the next couple of decades when we go to a central bank digital currency, a government identification, and the coming social credit system. Like that will be the real shift from conquering nature for the human benefit to conquering human nature for the convenience of the state. That will be the great shift. But that's entirely visible to people like Heidegger and Strauss in different ways, very different ways, because Heidegger's an historicist. He thinks it's an historical epoch, and a different way of thinking can lead us out of it. So we've come to the modern solution. I'll just discuss this briefly, and then we'll have a break and we can have a more general discussion. So he spends some time on Machiavelli, who is very important to his understanding of how modernity develops. And we looked rather at Hobbes and Locke, but they stand on Machiavelli's shoulders in the following way. Machiavelli says, unlike the classics, we're not going to look at what people profess, that their notions of justice, their notions of human excellence. We're not going to look at that from the inside, the way that Strauss suggests Aristotle is doing. We're going to say, no, human beings act out of necessity, that is, to do good for themselves, whether or not it harms others. And given that situation, given that human beings are by nature bad, we need to learn to be able to be bad too, in order to retain our estate. So therefore, society as a whole, the community as a whole, no longer has a substantial common good to which you can be dedicated. And rather, your excellence is defined by the state itself. So in Aristotle was saying, we read in book 3, chapter 9 of the Politics. That was one of the ones that we actually read through, where he was arguing against the Democrat and against the oligarch that neither equality nor property is the criteria for excellence. Rather, it's what he says there is political virtue. And the excellence and happiness of the citizen is the aim of the state. Whereas after Machiavelli, virtue or excellence is in the service of the state. It doesn't contribute to your happiness. It's something that you employ to maintain the state. Now, Strauss contends that Machiavelli appears to have opened up a new depth, but in fact contracts the horizon of human life. And this is what I would call reductive thought, and I'll mention something about that shortly. Okay, Strauss also contends that he's the first philosopher to embark on a campaign of propaganda to actualize a political teaching, and that his offspring are in the first place, the republicanism that led in Britain to the revolution and the execution of Charles I in 1640, I think. But that, he says, pales before his indirect legacy in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment refounded political philosophy on this new standard that people are self-seeking and not by nature political. So there's not by nature a common good, and there is not by nature an excellence that is supra-political, that is relative to human nature and not to the state. And the way he describes that is, there is another essay of his called The Three Waves of Modernity, and he describes that in brief here. And for time, I might just skip to a couple of suggestions I have about the essay. Then we can have a break and just then talk about the principles of each of the thinkers we've discussed, or we can follow the discussion as you wish to take it. Okay, so Strauss is saying that modern political thought is reductive in the sense that it reduces the high to the low. So the high would be opinions about justice, the low is rational self-interest. And that becomes typical of modern thought per se. So if you think of Freud, so a work of art or literature can be reduced to a suppressed and perverted desire for sex and power. Or in Marx, works of literature, statesmanship, and art are in fact merely ideology that can ultimately be understood in relation to who owns the means of production, and so on. This is a very typical modern way of thinking. What we appreciate as high is reducible to the low. Now, the low includes the conditions of life of any kind, and therefore modern political life, which follows modern political philosophy, promotes rights, universal rights, as opposed to rights derivative upon some kind of rank in society. Universal rights, peace, and wealth, and they are, from the point of view of classical and modern philosophy, these are genuine goods. Unfortunately, modern political philosophy understands them in such a way that they undermine the possibility of judging as good the life that they support, whatever character it has. So the problem that Strauss identifies in political science is that it cannot justify either science or its morality. So he makes this point that the social scientists he knows act at, they reproduce their teachings in publications for people to read, and they are dedicated to the country in which they live and so on. But their science cannot justify those moral attitudes, and in fact undercuts them. The inevitable deterioration produced by a standard of knowledge which denies rational distinctions between ends is that people avow non-rational ends or identities. As I mentioned before, for some reason, I preferred to page 20 of his essay, and I'll just have a look and see if there's something relevant. Okay, so he's talking here about the political scientist understanding, for example, dedication to the truth and dedication to democracy as values, whilst they have those values. When he says that democracy is a value which is not evidently superior to the opposite value, he does not mean that he is impressed by the alternative which he rejects, or that his heart or his mind is torn between alternatives which in themselves are equally attractive. So your 1950s political scientist, and in fact your 2005 political scientist, they're not torn between Nazism and democracy. They're attached to democracy. Right? But as scientists, as political scientists, they can't say that one is better than the other. So therefore, his quote, ethical neutrality is so far from being nihilism or a road to nihilism that it is not more than an alibi for thoughtlessness and vulgarity. By saying that democracy and truth are values, he says, in effect, that one does not have to think about the reasons why these things are good, and that he may bow, as well as anyone else, to the values that are adopted and respected by his society. Social science positivism fosters not so much nihilism as conformism and philisteinism. So that I think applies to all the natural sciences as well as the social sciences. So because the standard of a science that cannot choose between ends or values, that undermines the attachment to any values. And so when a new movement comes along, both the social and the natural sciences have absolutely no defense against it. And you'll see that as you saw it in the 60s with social movements that swept through the universities, and the social scientists and the natural sciences had no defense. The natural sciences stood up to some degree because they could still say, well, there are objective standards for mathematics, but that can only last so long, and they're going now. So, right. Now, my suggestion, the broader issue is that the understanding of political life and the relatively rational and relatively just regimes that the classics identified are not the only kinds of political life. They are bordered by irrational and unjust forms of political life. And Aristotle's example is the pre-civilized family or tribe, and tribe is based on a family, which he describes in the most barbaric terms. And there's also the nation, which is ruled by an emperor in which everyone's a slave. So there are other forms of communal life that are not a political regime in which reason to some extent is possible. Political reason, political thought, and possibly political philosophy. It's possible for political life to degenerate into pre-rational or irrational and unjust forms. And my suggestion, of course, is that we are heading into one of those currently, due to the character of technology, as I've mentioned. Okay, so for me, and I think for Strauss in that essay, the key question is technology, which produces the goods necessary for a certain life on the basis of an answer about the only goods in life. So, Descartes, Bacon say these are and Locke and Hobbes, these are the only goods, right? Self-preservation and comfort, to sum up. But this appearance is deceptive. Technology is dedicated to eroding any significance between ends and replacing them with an ever more efficient means to a low kind of life, the self-preservation and so on. You can see the problem simply by noting that technology does not produce leisure. Our leisure-saving devices have destroyed the possibility of leisure. Technology cannot be understood as a simple tool of human desires because it gradually, and in other times at greater rates of speed, is modifying and constraining the character of human desire itself. So that's my suggestion and footnote to Strauss's suggestion in the essay about the centrality of the question of technology. We'll take a break.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I was just going to say, I don't think that, my guess is that neither you nor Strauss, if he was still alive, would want to go back to every farmer using the plough that you mentioned before.
No, that's not the point. That's not the point. That was merely to illustrate how, some...
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you know, I say that to suggest I don't think that. My guess is you and Strauss would not want to go back to the technology of 100 years ago, if it was possible to go back to the technology of 100 years ago, because, you know, then, you know, we'd be paying $30 a kilogram for tomatoes instead of $5.
Don't worry, that's coming back.
Yeah, but I mean, it would. Oh, look, I think it's a bit too. It's not a good time to talk about that. Yeah. So, is it break time?
Yeah.
Before you break, is there a word missing in the first line under suggestions?
Yes.
Is it, it understands the high in the light of the low?
Yes, there is. Sorry, I typed this
In the
out
light of the low.
7 seconds before we meet. So
Yeah, Michael. During the break, can I have a quick word to you during the break?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
I'll stay on.
okay,
Yeah.
so we'll come back at 7:15. That's
Okay.
and then
Thank you.
Chris, if you want to make up your suggestion, your refutation.
No, it was just a question.
Yeah,
It's a question about. My question is about what Strauss was reacting to and what he was concerned about when he developed his own approach, you know, when he got to the United States. So he was born at the turn of the century and he was educated by, amongst other people, by Heidegger, and he had enormous esteem and also disdain for Heidegger. So what, like in Europe at that time and in America, I've got a feeling that there were no political science departments. My sense of it, my memory of it is that people like Weber was kind of regarded generally as a social scientist, and you know, in the universities in Germany at the turn of the century, there were philosophy departments, there were economics departments. So what is like when did we have the emergence of university studies in politics that led to the sort of situation that Leo Strauss was responding to? Because, you know, I've read a little bit about how he was sort of looked at as a weird European when he got there, that he wanted to do the sort of things that you've just been discussing.
all the advanced thought of the time was derivative from people like Weber. This was the new exciting thing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And that's how you made your career, by bringing in new concepts in value-free social science.
Yeah.
It was, and you know, that was when things like sociology departments were invented.
Well, yeah.
There were government departments, and they had, you know, comparative, you know, history, political philosophy, and so on. But the exciting, cutting edge stuff, exactly like, you know, just my frame of reference is when I was going to the American Political Science Association, which used to be government or whatever. All the cutting edge stuff is the people doing empirical research, which is a kind of attempt to be scientific. That's self-deceptive in the way that Strauss remarks, because clearly these people have a whole range of political inclinations that inform who they ask, what question they ask, and the results that they get. So yeah.
There's one aspect though of the modern approach that I think is important and extremely valuable, and that is that teachers should not push their political opinions, including about who to vote and so on, down the throats of their students. And this was something that was remarked upon by Weber in his incredible lectures, Science as a Vocation, where many of the students, most of whom were on the left, so it was the same 100 years ago as now, wanted him to take a certain position during the World War I crisis in Germany. And he said, no, it's not the position. of a teacher in the university to dictate to his students, or not even to dictate, but to run his own line as part of his teaching. And I think that's a very important and valuable
It's
thing.
only possible. It's only possible even as an aspiration if there is something like the truth, and you say you're a teacher, you're in a class, and you're trying to A, uncover, and B, communicate the truth. But if there is no truth, or the truth is historically relative, then inevitably you will be attempting to discern what is true for us now, and then you can't help but say, if you do anything else but this, then you're betraying our identity. Okay, so, and therefore a responsible person will feel compelled to enforce a certain political view. Okay, so
Martin, I'm not sure if you want to get into the sort of general discussion at this stage, or is that for later?
I'm happy to have a general discussion. Yeah.
Well, the question that occurs to me is, going back up the line beyond Plato and Aristotle, what is the good? What is the virtuous life? Now, you've said a number of times that the questions are important, and you may not be able, ever able to definitively answer them in a way that's accepted universally for all time. But you've still got to grapple with them, haven't you? And do any of the classical philosophers address that?
Yes.
And what answers do they come up with?
Well, Aristotle's ethics begins by asking, what's the human good? Answer, well, we call it happiness, but the content's disputed. And to sort out the question of the content, he says, well, what's the characteristic human activity? Well, we have speech or reason, logos. So it's using speech or reason in the best way possible that would define human excellence and therefore and lead to human happiness. And he says, well, we act and we think. So let's discuss acting. So he discusses the ethical virtues in the first half of the book. And then he discusses the intellectual virtues that you need to have the ethical virtues. You need to have a certain amount of practical judgment to know how to be just or courageous, or when it's best to run, or when to fight, and so on. And that leads him to explicitly rethink the ethical virtues in the light of intellectual excellence. And that leads him to friendship. And then ultimately in book 10, he reveals that the highest way of life is the one devoted to thought itself. And ethical virtue leads to a secondary happiness. So the answer to the question of what the good life is the life spent in philosophy, his life. Now that's sometimes mocked as well. He's just written a long book defending his own perspective. But if he is an intelligent person with a certain range of activities he can undertake, if he can't justify the one he takes, then he's like the modern social scientist who can't justify their activity. So at the core of classical political philosophy is the justification of the supra-political life devoted to the truth. Because in that case, if it is in accord with human nature to try and perfect your mental faculties, then that has the following consequence. It's in accord with human nature that there be something that is completely shareable, and that your highest passions and faculties can unite to comprehend, but that is also shareable perfectly as the truth is shareable. So if you show me how the Pythagoras's theorem works, then you don't lose anything by communicating that truth to me. Now, in all the political goods, money, wealth, honor, they're not shareable. And honor's the key. Honor's not shareable. So the solution for a regime in which as many people as possible can participate is to rule and rule in turn. This is Aristotle's phrase. So that citizens rule, and then, yeah, you take your turn being on the jury, you take your turn investigating the performance of the general, and so on. So that, yeah, that's his answer. There is this strict, yeah.
I mean, the truth about what?
Socrates makes this joke in the Republic. He says, when you ask people what the good is, some people, vulgar people, will say pleasure, but everyone admits there's good and bad pleasures. So there's a standard of the good outside pleasure. The more refined people will say, well, it's thought, it's being phronomoi, it's being intelligent. And then when you ask them intelligent about what, they'll say about the good. So the good is being intelligent about the good, and that's a circle.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, to me, you don't get away from a religious view. What is our end?
But then, okay, but that requires, you know, that someone has an experience that there is an end that is not of this life, whereas these Aristotle and Plato are talking about this life. And they can share common ground with, say, Aquinas, who, when he talks about this life, has that agreement with them. But his criticism is that from his point of view, they're not aware of, from his point of view, the real end.
I think there's a certain perhaps overlap between the religious view, it's not just a Christian view, and the classical view, in the sense that both of them pay a lot of attention to, you know, what is sometimes called the one, as being, you know, the being of beings, the one. And I remember you a couple of courses ago making a joke about how Aristotle was asked about the final end of his teaching, and when he said it was seeing the one, people just thought, oh, so what? What does that mean? But it actually does have a big meaning, an important meaning, both in metaphysics, like Aristotelian, you know, metaphysics, but also in Christian and Islamic and Jewish philosophy, including the mysticism of those religions.
Yeah, so it takes some time to explicate that. And let's just stick with the political realities. But that was a lecture by, well, Aristotle. I forget the person's name, but he wrote a book on harmonics. And in it, he reported that Aristotle used to say that Plato gave a lecture on the good, and people came expecting to hear something, you know, glorious and tangible, how to gain wealth and power and glory. And when he started talking about abstract or geometrical things, and finished by saying that the good is one, they all left disappointed, or left during the argument.
They went down the pub.
Yeah. Let me quickly run through. I'll just run through just the principles of the people we've discussed. I won't go through all of this, but just as a background to our further discussion. So Plato talks about the democracy in the light of a best city that he turns into a myth, and that's probably impossible. And it's meant to be a just city, which is founded on injustice, because its principles, everyone does their own work, but the work of the philosopher is to think, and they have to make the philosopher rule, and so on. It has all these internal contradictions. So he tells this myth: there's a just city, becomes an oligarchy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and then a tyranny. So just for the purpose of our course, the principle of democracy for Socrates and Plato is freedom. And the psychological essence of freedom is the notion that all the desires are of equal rank. So that's the principle. Now, from Socrates' point of view, you can retain a healthy democracy only so long as you have undemocratic habits. because because democracies fail because their psychological essence, which is the notion that all desires are equal, will undermine all your customs and traditions and principles, and it will undermine gradually even reality, so that the animals are equal with the humans and so on. And it turns into a tyranny in two ways. One, it turns into internally into a tyranny because extreme Democrats can't stand to distinguish between better and worse desires. They insist that there is no argument, or there's no reason to choose one desire over another, and that's the end of all philosophy. Now, Socrates is talking about this in the context of the only regime that philosophy appears in, so he's arguing both, for and against democracy of a certain kind. And secondly, it turns into a tyranny when, someone spirited enough takes the side of the whole people against the wealthy, and says, we will take their riches and distribute them. But I, as your representative, need to be protected by a bodyguard. And that's how the tyrant installs himself at the head of the military, as the protector of the people. Okay, so fair enough. Aristotle, just quickly. So for Aristotle, again, the principle is equality and freedom. And he interprets, so whereas Socrates is saying you can have a good democracy when it's undergirded by habits or traditions that are not democratic. I don't mean they're tyrannical, I just mean that they're not in accord with the principle of equality or freedom. And so for Aristotle, similarly, you can have equality and freedom in two ways. One is majority or mob rule, which he's not in favor of, or you have citizens that rule and are ruled in turn. And he thinks if you have that established, you have a democratic regime that may be able to last. But he also warns that the basic principle, that is equality, may infect all of the regime and not just this particular principle of rule. And similar to Socrates, democracies fail when popular leaders exploit the rich or incite the people to exploit the rich, and that tends to lead to a revolution in which the oligarchs take over. Okay, so Hobbes.
Sorry, just on Aristotle.
Yep.
So the principle of democracy is, did you say equality and freedom?
Yep. Well, he says equality first and then freedom, because it's almost like the reverse of what Socrates said. He's saying it's equal, everyone can live as they like. But that means you must be free to live as you like, and you must be free of constraint.
Yeah.
Whereas Socrates starts from the principle is freedom, and that means all desires are equal. So he goes from the political principle to the psychology undergirding it. So now, when Socrates and Aristotle criticize democracy, they're saying that democracy has certain advantages, but it neglects the true standard of right, which should inform the government and legislation of a society. And that means that there is a standard of natural right by which civilizations can be judged. Hobbes rejects that because he says, if there's a standard outside the society, you've undercut the rule of law in that society, because people can appeal from the law to that standard. So his argument is that what is by nature right is not a standard by which you can judge action, thought, law, regime. Rather, what is right is freedom or liberty, the freedom to do whatever you want to preserve yourself. That, of course, leads to the war of everyone against everyone, and that leads to the rational decision to make a social contract and give up your rights in order to have them protected by a sovereign. I didn't quite finish that line. But the principle of democracy is the right that's being not disenfranchised, it's been translated to the sovereign. And democracies fail when the law is not upheld. That is, the sovereign doesn't do the work for which they are in the position of sovereign, or there are teachings, such as the classical and medieval political philosophers, that undermine the rule of law by positing that there is a natural standard by which we can judge the law. Then we come to the classic of modern liberal philosophy, modern liberal political philosophy, which is Locke. And his argument against Hobbes is that if we give up our rights to a sovereign who then is not held to the law, then we've given up our rights to get away from tyranny, and we've landed ourselves in tyranny. So we must either have direct rule or representation in the government. So he's the beginning of a modern representative liberal democracy. The principle of democracy is the preservation of our property, beginning with the body and onto the goods that we have made ours by the use of the body, and then on the wealth that we have made through those goods, and so on. The failure of democracy occurs when the state no longer protects that the fundamental law of property, beginning with the body and going on to the fruit of your labor. And if a majority decides that the state has not lived up to that standard and overthrows it, that's just in Locke's viewpoint. And the words in which he describes that are very close to the words at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence by the United States, where the government has failed to uphold the rights of the citizens, it can be overthrown. Okay, now in Strauss's teaching and in reality, the modern principles can be either, you could say, perverted, or they could come to their radical end in two different ways. One, if you say that the principle is not the end of life, so as in Hobbes, the individual wants to preserve their power because they want to be able to have access to any end as it pleases them. And the state is the mean by which you preserve your power against the dangers to your self-preservation. But if the end is power, then the state has to be not only indifferent to any end, it has to promote all ends as being equal and try to produce goods for everyone to pursue their own ends. And that's Rawls in 1970, and now his thought is a cliche. The other alternative, which is slightly more thoughtful, is that if power is primacy, then there is no justice. Justice is that which has been created and imposed by those people who have power. And so there is no natural right of any kind. So that's, you can regard those as perversions of modern natural right, or radicalizations of them, but they end in a kind of self-contradiction. So that was the rapid summary. So, but I just thought if I went through that, we could discuss more broadly any of the issues which it raises.
It's really extremely interesting, all of this stuff. And one of the things that I find curious is that we tend these days not to be that interested in the meaning of equality. I mean, somehow it's important to all of us, but as well as equality being important to all of us, so is inequality important to all of us because of the differences that we all have from each other. And we never get past kind of slogans when we talk about these things. And that's one of the really disappointing aspects of modern debates about equality and justice, in my opinion.
Yes, no, we do have a crisis in the low level of debate. That's just the result of the fact that our education system shot itself in the head to lose weight a few generations back.
But there's, I mean, at the risk of descending to definitions, there are so many words that have lost meaning and precision. Justice, equality, I mean, in the media today, racism and bullying. I mean, we take words and use them. Somebody had the expression suitcase words, that you just, pack whatever inferences, allusions, references you like into these words and throw them around. And you've got to give it some precision, some narrowness to justice and equality if you're going to use them as the ends of political society.
Yeah, there seems to have been a kind of erosion of care. So this is perhaps a little bit getting back to Heidegger, a little bit of erosion of care in the way that we speak publicly and maybe even privately. Michael, a couple of courses ago, Martin put up a speech from somebody in the 1950s, and it was about the sort of erosion of the private sphere of standards of conduct, and the consonant with that, the rise of state intervention in regulation of everything under the sun. And one of the odd things is that, for example, in the past, if in the English-speaking world, you would say madam to a woman if you didn't know her, madam, or sir to a man.
How
And
dare you misgender that person?
yeah, no, well, not just that. Somebody told me the other day that if you refer to a woman now in America or Australia, that is actually a woman as madam. That's an insult, because basically, if you refer to someone as madam, or you say address them as madam, that's this is from brothels, and it's an insult. But of course, one reply to that is, well, it's not insulting to be a prostitute, because they're actually not. They're sex workers. They're a vital part of the economy. The way that language has become so contested in so many ways, it's just extraordinary.
This is where Orwell was so prescient in 1984.
Yeah.
If you control language, you control how people think.
Yeah.
I mean, incredibly prescient. Political correctness has proved it for a couple of decades now.
Yeah, well, the thing about political correctness, though, is that when people, I think it's important to try to be politically correct, but usually when things are politically correct, it means they're basically the opposite. They're incorrect.
That's because you have different politics. Yeah. So, but the passage you were referring to before was actually written in 1920, but what he was
the article, Martin?
I forget the title. I'll send it around. It's only
If you could, please. Yeah, that'd be great.
He's actually a Chief Justice in Great Britain, as well as he ran the munitions effort during the First World War. He's a man of many talents. And yeah, his point was as follows, that as there are basically three areas of life: those in which are purely private and up to you, those that the government controls, and those that we leave up to the character as it's determined and as it's informed by the people as a whole. And what we're doing is shrinking the middle ground of where an education in the character of the people that you belong to, and we're growing the area of government control. And the way I would put that is Aristotle and Socrates are arguing that a particular political community will give you a particular ethos, and that ethos is going to be more or less good, more or less effective, but that is the best way in which to live as a community, to live a full human life, because the more area that has to be specified by the law, that's no longer fully human, and the particularly private is of relevance for them only in thought, only in philosophy. But what we are doing, what we've witnessed, and it's been going on for hundreds of years. I read a book recently by a British historian on the British Constitution in the 1930s or something, and by Young, G.M. Young, and he was saying that the great problem they were facing in the 20s and 30s is that it's government by bureaucratic diktat, because you put through some legislation and then all the secondary legislation is made up by bureaucrats and they just append it, and that becomes the law. And so you're no longer being governed by explicit laws explicitly made by the lawmakers. You're being governed by bureaucrats who write all this stuff and just append it to already passed legislation. And we have that times 1,000 now, I'm assuming.
Well, we've seen it in the US with executive orders under Obama and now under Biden.
Yeah.
But we've got the same problem in Australia because Parliament doesn't really debate legislation. The government departments tell Parliamentary Council what they want in the law and how to draft it. And it's far too complicated for the sort of people in Parliament now to understand. And they just vote it through. The legislators should be scrutinising, debating, challenging the laws that are put up. So even at the legislative level, we're not getting that proper dialectic.
Yeah.
And of course, the other problem is laws never get repealed. Look at 18C of the Discrimination Act. Laws get in and they never get repealed.
Yeah, there's definitely an enormous amount of institutional inertia in just in the modern Western liberal democracies as a whole. And that inertia is the same thing as there's less political life.
Yeah.
There's less ability to participate and for things, to be debated and for actual changes in course or opinion and policy. Instead, we seem to have this monolithic motion.
But to go back to that article, whatever it was from 1920, 1930 by the English judge, the private sphere is shrinking too because government is legislating what you can say and what you think. And, you read every day about people who basically got orders that they get re-educated. They've got to go away and have their attitudes changed by some sort of re-education on identity, on racism, whatever it is. So that the private sphere is shrinking as much as the sphere where you rely on character and civil society. And
once we have the appropriate digital laws in place, that it will be almost non-existent. We'll be like, at the beginning of 1984, where he's trying to hide from his flat screen TV that can see into his room in the corner. Yeah, it'll be that will be the metaphor by which we.
China's doing it now.
Yeah.
That's why you stay off social media.
Yes, one of the reasons.
It's a bleak outlook, Martin.
Yeah, no, this is the course in the bleak future. I was actually just confronted by someone saying, well, what's the solution? And I said that I gave the solution in, I think it was 2002, which is that we adopt the educational curriculum from 1895 in Britain as our curriculum. And then that will lead immediately to a sharpening of perspectives, of a depth of understanding of good and bad and justice and injustice, and to some kind of debate. But that has zero chance of being implemented. So I think we are headed into.
Is it possible to get a copy of that?
Copy of what? Sorry.
An 1895 English school curriculum.
I'm speaking hypothetically. I don't actually.
The reason I ask is years ago in a secondhand box shop in Mossvale, I found a copy of the Blue Book, which was the New South Wales primary school curriculum before the Wyndham scheme. And not just the volume and level of that curriculum and the content of values and so on was staggering to browse through it. That applied till the early 60s in New South Wales, and then bang, all gone. There is a solution.
Right.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, live not by lies. I mean, we go back to your course before this one, truth. I mean, if there's one thing that is going to provide a solution, it's honesty, a search for the truth and living by the truth. Solzhenitsyn was absolutely right to demand honesty in all levels of life.
And that's one of the things that Strauss remarks in a different way, very different way in the essay, when he's trying to argue that although our view of things can be very distorted by understandings of what knowledge is and so on, political life is inescapably about what's better and worse, and points to a view of what's good for a human being. And any kind of political discussion will reflect that. And so it's those questions are inescapable. The question is, for us, is whether or not we can escape those questions being banned from discourse. But you're right, in the same way, our dilemmas point to the search for the truth. And so that one way in which to resist any forces that are dehumanizing is to show that and make an example of that. Yeah.
But the practical application of it is in the word honesty.
What is interesting is where this what Strauss would make of that, because he's famous. He's most famous for doing what is not the most important thing about his thought, but he's most famous for rediscovering this tradition of exoteric and esoteric thought. And the intention behind which, the reason why he exposed it was to say, against historicism, people are not definitively tied to their own historical epochs, because here we have, for example, Maimonides, Al-Farabi, Plato, all thinking the same thing, but teaching very differently because they've adapted their thought to the convictions of their time. And underlying that is the notion that all societies are based upon opinions and convictions that cannot be turned into knowledge, because it's the aspiration to knowledge that is philosophy itself. And that can't happen on a whole communal scale. Plato's cave. The community is always a cave. You have better or worse caves, but the search for the truth is therefore private.
Is that his book, Persecution and the Art of Writing?
That's his main exposition of it. There's a couple of other essays, and
There's a lot of reading to do to flesh this out.
Yeah, there's always more reading. Yeah. And any thoughts? So just as a matter of reality, the next couple of courses that I'm going to be teaching through the Plato Academy of Melbourne, and they'll be on the pre-Socratic. So there's the 2 6-week courses, and then after that, I was planning to do a couple of different things. Aristotle's De Anima, part of the On Tyranny discussion by Strauss and Kojève. And I had a few other thoughts, doing Othello. But I'd be curious if
Othello, Shakespeare's play.
Yeah.
Wow, that'd be interesting.
We've done The Tempest and King Lear. So once a year I'll teach a Shakespeare play.
Wow. All sounds good to me. I've signed up for the pre-Socratics, the first one.
Okay.
It better be Zoom because I'm not coming to Melbourne.
Yeah, it'll be Zoom, even if we are re-enfranchised with rights to enter buildings, we'll still have it on Zoom.
But all of that, from my perspective, all of that sounds good.
Yeah.
All interesting.
So Martin, do we sign up in the same spot for the pre-Socratics? Is that
Actually, yeah, if you want to sign up for that, then it's on their website, but there's a link on our website that
okay? Yep, I'll find it then. Yep, brilliant.
It's the Plato Academy or something, isn't it?
yeah, PAM, Plato Academy of Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, there's a link on our site through to their sign up page, and
More material, Martin. There's what, just the handout from today that you worked through today.
yes,
That's the only additional document to be provided.
yeah,
And they're helpful, those summary handouts.
good. Yeah. Please don't publish because yeah, very tentative suggestions. And I'll deny them when the book comes out, you know.
You writing
They're
a book?
for my files only.
Sorry?
I keep them in my files only.
Right, very good.
Just for, it's like for your eyes only. It's for my files only.
Thank you.
Martin, you're writing a book?
I'm actually writing an essay, but I am working up to a book on that's a rewriting of my thesis on the Platonic depiction of the Socratic turn from pre-Socratic thought to the Socrates we know in the Platonic dialogues.
No.
But the last thing I wrote was the introduction to Stanley Rosen's Phaedrus interpretation, which I discovered when he retired, and I went through his office, and that's just been published a month or two ago, and I'm sending off for some copies, so we'll have a book launch. I'm hoping we can do it in a park or something.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, so I'll bring copies for cheap. But yeah, it's written during one of his very vigorous periods in the 70s. Yeah, it's good.
So what,
We'll do a course.
posthumously published?
Sorry?
Posthumously published.
Yeah, posthumously. Yeah, I confronted him with it and said the world needs this, its existence must be made known. And he said, well, students ought to have such things. Very ambiguous. It's not like, maybe he's suggesting I should just take it home and I can read it myself. But I took that to be permission to edit it and publish it. And but he saw, he saw it when I started the editing, so he was happy with it. But yeah.
All right, we'll see you in May.
Yeah, I hope to see you. Yeah, I'll see you then. Thanks for coming along to this course, Trish and Anson and Michael.
Thank you so much.
thank
It's
you.
been
Thanks for
so
having me.
amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I haven't contributed. I'm just too busy listening and taking it all in. It's just, every sentence blows my socks off. It's really good. So thank you very much. It's hugely appreciated to make a big difference.
Well, thanks, Trish. Thanks very much.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. All right, take care. See you in the next course.
Yeah,
Or at the book launch, whichever comes first.
absolutely. All the best.
Thanks so much, Martin. Take care.
Thanks, Martin.
Bye.
All the best.
Thank you.
Take care.